In this chapter, chapter 28, we're dealing with Johann Sebastian Bach and his final masterpiece, The Art of the Fugue. Now, you really need to take some time and understand what a fugue is. Go through this chapter, spend the time learning the main information. Know what the subject is, know what the counter subject is, or the answer. Understand what the exposition is, and understand all of the elements of how you can stretch this tiny little tune, this tiny little subject, in so many different ways. Remember, you can invert it or flip it upside down, do a mirror image of the tune. You can do it backwards. Well, that looks forwards from this direction. How about this way? Backwards. There we go. You can go backwards, or what we call retrograde, or you can go backwards and flip it upside down. We call that retrograde inversion. And that's not even counting augmentation, where you stretch things out, or diminution, where you shorten it up, right? So this was basically the equivalent of musical calculus for the Baroque era. And Bach was so good at writing fugues that he could sit down at the organ and improvise a fugue at will. He could just make up a subject and then start writing the other parts of the fugue as he went along. Think about that. If you could just sit down and come up with a super hard math formula off the top of your brain and then be able to figure out the answer for it or the proof of it all in one go with not a single mistake. That's what Bach could do. And yet Bach was not famous as a composer during his own lifetime. He did not have the fame and the fortune of Vivaldi, or even to a larger degree, Handel. Bach was completely unknown outside of being a great organist. He was known as a performer, but not as a composer. It took until the 1800s and a composer named Felix Mendelssohn to rediscover Bach and to promote his music to the public. Now, other composers studied Bach. Mozart studied Bach. Beethoven studied Bach. But people didn't play Bach. People didn't listen to Bach. Right? He wasn't popular. And now he's one of the central figures in Western classical music. And as I've said before, with Bach, if you go to school to study music, you're going to study Bach. More Bach than you ever wanted to study. He is the epitome of the Baroque era and its goals in music. So this is his contrapunctus number 1, I believe, from The Art of the Fugue. It's written for any group of 4 instruments. And what's really interesting about this particular masterpiece is that Bach writes one subject and then creates a series of 14 separate fugues, different fugues, all based off that same subject. And he does a few canons just for fun as well. What's really interesting is the very last tune in this collection just kind of stops, just kind of ends, kind of like an ellipsis at the end of a sentence. And it kind of gives the feeling of music's going to continue. Music's going to continue to evolve, and it's going to continue to become better, more complex. There will be other composers who come after me. So it's a really interesting look at Bach's final work.